since the end of 1800. The Jews were welcome in that land under the Ottoman Empire, which nowadays called Palestine. But persecution and pogroms in the Russian Empire started two significant events. The two Aliyah. Aliyah, in Hebrews, is intended as the immigration of the Jews from the diaspora to the Promised Land, or rather the Land of Israel, in the region of Palestine in the early 1900s. "25,000 and 35,000 Jews immigrated to Palestine just before the World War I, inspired by the Zionist Movement idealism to establish a homeland for the Jewish people. But why the Palestine, and what is the Zionist movement? The modern Palestine, in Jewish tradition, is a region which roughly corresponding to the Land of Israel. Furthermore, there were several proposals for a Jewish state, such as Canada, Alaska, Argentina, Uganda, Madagascar, Oblast and URSS, and others. But the Zionists were only interested in Palestine. The Zionist movement, or Zionism, is a nationalist Jewish movement. It emerged in 19th century, founded by the Austro-Hungarian Jewish journalist Theodor Herzl, who's after the Dreyfus Affair, reached the conclusion that anti-Jewish sentiment would make Jewish assimilation impossible. And after the persecution of Jews, which started around the 605 BC, up to the Russian pogroms at the end of 1800s, there was the needs to find a land for the Jews in order to establish a Jewish state, whereas the Jewish people would no longer be persecuted. Herzl published Der Judenstaat, a pamphlet in which he explained his visions of a Jewish homeland. Herzl didn't consider the problem of Palestine's inhabitants at all. He referred to Palestine as a land without people and urged that it should be given to the Jews as a people without land. In the middle of 1800, following the increase in the Jewish population, the Turkish government tried to prevent Jewish immigration and settlement in Palestine, imposing a series of entry restrictions, allowing foreign Jews just as visitors, preventing the Jews acquire foreign nationality and real estate, and asking other powers not to lend any support to the Zionist movement. But the Western powers chose to promote the Jewish colonization. Why? Because the Jews used a bug in an Ottoman law. The Germany needs to maintain the integrity of the Ottoman Empire, but they also had interest to promote the Zionist settlement. The Kaiser Wilhelm II thought the Jews could play a very important role in the Germany's expansion towards the east, also called in German Drang nach Osten. He was convinced that supporting the Jewish settlement to the Holy Land could bring the sympathy of the Zionists and at the same time bring millions into the purse of the Turks, which were headed for bankruptcy. Dismember the Turkish Empire would not be so easy. The Germans had interest in his preservation. The Russian government was guided by similar consideration, and to preventing to not leave the Germany as the principal supporter, they joined in the supporter states for the future Israel. The French was extremely against the Jews' settlement because they had always regarded the Syria region, then also Palestine, as her sphere of interest. Anyway, we can see that the main power's concern was the preservation of their privileges under the capitulations, contracts between the Ottoman Empire and several European powers, initially made to encourage commercial exchange with Western merchants, which granted significant economic and political advantages to the Western. These capitulation certificates didn't mention the religion of the possessor, and the local authorities weren't able so easily to distinguish European Jews from just European. Then the Jews settlers used this fail to easily evade the Turkish restrictions and penetrate in Palestine. This meant a very important thing. The Turkish capitulation was an institution ridden with abuses, obsolete, and about to be abolished, and the powers couldn't make it happen. Thus they had no choice but become the promoters of Jewish colonization in Palestine. According to Anita Shapira, among 19th and early 20th century Zionists, the Arabs in Palestine were viewed as one more of the many misfortunes present in Palestine, like the Ottoman authorities, the climate, Difficulties of adjustment. The Zionist organization did not discuss this issue during that period and did not formulate a political line on it. In November 1914, the Russian Empire, French and the British declared war on the Ottoman Empire. In the middle of World War I, on the basis of the McMahon-Hussein Correspondence, the British government had an agreement with Hussein bin Ali, Sharif of Mecca. The United Kingdom would have agreed to recognize the Arab independence in exchange for the Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire. The Arab nationalists aimed to create an independent Arab state, from Aleppo in Syria to Aden in Yemen. The revolt started on 10th June 1916 at Mecca, and just 5 months earlier, the British signed a secret treaty to divide the Ottoman provinces, with the France even before having conquered it. An act of betrayal in the eyes of the Arabs. This secret treaty is called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, named after 2 British and French diplomats, Marc Sykes and François-Georges Picot. The result was that the Ottoman provinces were divided between British and French by a line, the Sykes-Picot line. The French was allocated to the region A, the southeast of the Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, and the Kurdistan region. The United Kingdom was to control the region B, Jordan, southern Iraq, Palestine, and today, southern Israel. Furthermore, in 1917, during the Great War, the British government has committed to the Zionist Federation through the public statement called the Balfour Declaration, wrote by Lord Arthur Balfour, the United Kingdom's Foreign Secretary, to Lord Rothschild, a Zionist leader of the British Jewish community. Through that statement, His Majesty's government announcing its support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, which at the time included a small minority Jewish population. So the World War I ended in November 1918, and the British reneged on its promise and took over the administration of the Palestine and Transjordan through the Mandate for Palestine. The Foreign Secretary Lord Balfour conceded as early as 1919. The powers had made no statement of fact that is not admittedly wrong, and no declaration of policy which, at least in the letter, they have not always intended to violate. At this point, the Allies described the region of the future Palestine, Lebanon, the coastal and part of the internal area of Syria, as occupied enemy territory under the French, British, and Arab military administration, called OETA, Occupied Enemy Territory Administration. It was established a commission of inquiry, consisted by French, British, Italian, and American members, to be sent in Syria and Palestine to examine the wishes of inhabitants. After consultations with the inhabitants of Syria, the result was quite predictable. The vast majority were against the mandatory system, but aware of the need for outside assistance, as long as it came first from the United States, or secondly from Britain. But the Commission realized that the mandatory system was inevitable, and recommended that the United States should have the mandate for Syria, with Faisal al-Hussein as king, and Britain for Iraq, with an Arab monarch established. The mandates were intended of a limited duration, and the mandatory was in no sense a colonizing power. On the Zionist question, the Commission declared to be in favor of the Jews and to approve the Zionists' aspiration and plans, but with some concerns. The extreme Zionist program must be greatly modified if the civil and religious rights of the non-Jewish inhabitants of Palestine are to be protected in accordance with the terms of the Balfour Declaration. But after the Commission's discussions with the Zionists, they had no doubt. The Zionists looked forward to a practically complete dispossession of the present non-Jewish inhabitants of Palestine by various forms of purchase. However, in March 1918, Chaim Weizmann and the rest of the Zionist Commission arrived in Jerusalem, aimed to be a link between the British authorities and the Jewish population. They found Palestine overwhelmingly Arab, with the British in charge to establish a self-government as quickly as possible. There was no chance for the Zionists to be able to create a Jewish majority in Palestine before to the end of the British Mandate. The Arabs would be in the position to decide the size and kind of Jewish national home should exist in their country. As John Kimche wrote in Palestine or Israel, thus, when Weizmann departed for home in September 1918, his mission and that of the Zionist Commission was in effect at an end. They had come to lay the foundations of a Jewish state, and they left with Palestine set to become an Arab state. And it probably would have become one, but for the Hitler Holocaust and the Second World War. The Hashemites were prepared to accept the Balfour Declaration, and in January 1919, Faisal reached an agreement with Weizmann, which amount to acceptance of the official Zionist program for Palestine. Article 4 of the agreement read, "All necessary measures shall be taken to encourage and stimulate immigration of Jews into Palestine on a large scale, and as quickly as possible to settle Jewish immigrants upon the land through closer settlement and intensive cultivation of the soil. In taking such measures, the Arab peasants and tenant farmers shall be protected in their rights and shall be assisted in forwarding their economic development." On 29 September 1923, Palestine officially came under the control of Great Britain, and the right of the Jewish people to a national homeland in Palestine was recognized by the British and the League of Nations. The rise of Adolf Hitler was a further incentive for Jewish immigration to Palestine. Between 1933 and 1939, there was a great surge of Jews from all over Europe. Although initially it was encouraged by Zionist funds JNF and the optimistic economic prospects in Palestine, when the rest of the world was suffering from a slump. In 1938, the United States President Franklin Roosevelt called a conference at Evian in France to find a solution for the German and Austrian Jewish refugees wishing to flee persecution by Nazi Germany. It was a pathetic failure. Although the United States, Canada, and Australia, with their vast empty spaces, only offered to take a few thousand Jews, the Zionists had no desire to go anywhere but Palestine, so some of them actively worked against the conference. Between 1922 and 1939, Jewish colonies had increased from 47 to 200, and Jewish landholdings from 148,000 to 383,000 acres. But just in 1935, under British auspices, the Jewish population had increased from 57,000 in 1919 to 320,000. This uprising triggered a new revolt, although Jews and Arabs had been involved in a cycle of attacks and counterattacks since 1920. The revolt lasted almost 3 years and a half. It started as an act of spontaneous popular resistance and then seized by the Arab Higher Committee, focused on strikes and several forms of protest, which was defeated by the British civil administration with political concessions and international diplomacy 6 months later. The following years, as a consequence of British repression, another revolt began as a peasant-led resistance movement, and the rebellion was brutally suppressed by the British Army and the Palestine Police Force. There were 2,000 Arabs victims. 10% of the adult male Palestinian Arab population between 20 and 60 was killed. In response to these revolts, in May 1939, the British government issued the White Paper, a document which placed a limit on Jewish immigration to 75,000 Jews for 5 years, and also prohibited the purchase of Arab lands in total up to 5%. The document was rejected from both sides, although the moderate Arab party NDP, National Defense Party, was prepared to accept it. The Zionist groups started a campaign of attacks on government property, lasted several months. That was a taut break for the Jewish then. In order to find a solution, in May 1942, 600 delegates and Zionist leaders from around the world convened in New York City's hotel to lay out their political program. This meeting is historically recognized as the Biltmore Conference. after the name of the prestigious Biltmore Hotel in which it was held, and its resolution, the Biltmore Program, was a fundamental departure from the traditional Zionist policy. The program called for unlimited Jewish immigration to Palestine and the creation of a Jewish army. With this document, the Zionists demanded that Palestine be established as a Jewish commonwealth. President Roosevelt thought the Britain's White Paper of 1939 as reneging on the Balfour Declaration, another public statement issued from their government in 1917, and he came under increasing pressure from American Zionists and their allies in Congress to publicly denounce the White Paper and support a Jewish state. Furthermore, the Holocaust brought more urgency to the cancellation of the White Paper. So, the Biltmore Program was revised. For the first time, Jews from the Middle East and North Africa would be included in the immigration plan, as a single category alongside the European Jews, which fled from the pogroms and Nazism. Thus a new committee was established and a new plan was born, the immigration of 1 million Jews over 18 months in order to be completed in summer 1944, under the name of the 1 Million Plan. The plan was presented to the Jewish Agency Executive on 24 June 1944, while the British immigration restrictions were still in place. Before the end of the war, the Zionist leaders in London began to urge the cancellation of the British White Paper on Palestine of 1939 and to urge the immediate admission of 100,000 Jews to Palestine. Their hopes were raised when a Labour government took office, and at the Labour Party conference in 1944, a resolution had been passed saying that since there was no sense in a Jewish national home in Palestine, unless the Jews were a majority, there should be a transfer of population, and then let the Arabs be encouraged to move out as the Jews move in. A 1942 post-war planning paper by the State Department concluded, for the Jewish state to be successful, it might also be necessary for large numbers of the Arabs living there at present to be transplanted elsewhere.
As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, I have directed that all measures be taken for our defense, but always will our whole nation remember the character of the onslaught against us.
After World War II, in August 1945, President Truman asked for the admission of 100,000 Holocaust survivors into Palestine, but the British maintained limits on Jewish immigration in line with the White Paper of 1939. The Jewish community rejected the restriction on immigration and organized an armed resistance. At this point, the Jews had an army, the Irgun, a plan, and a Nazi genocide laid on their shoulders. The British triggered the Jewish insurgency in Mandatory Palestine, a series of revolt by the Jews, against who had permitted the Jewish immigration, the British government. After 2 years of Jewish insurgency, after the cost of several years to maintain troops in Palestine, and after the economic crisis as a result of World War II, on September 1947, the British government, who has put itself in charge to maintain the control on Palestine, decided to leave. The Arab population in Palestine felt betrayed by the British for the second time, and they started another revolt against the British and the Jewish army at the same time, which immediately began a civil war. The 1947-1948 Civil War in Mandatory Palestine. Following the British statement, the United Nations took in charge the future of the Palestine, which proposed a partition plan called Resolution 181. The plan recommended the creation of independent Arab and Jewish states, with an economically bounding and a special international regime for Jerusalem. The UN formed the committee to prepare a report on recommendations for Palestine, UNSCOP, United Nations Special Committee on Palestine. The Jewish Agency pressed for Jewish representation and the exclusion of both Britain and Arab countries on the committee. During the visit, the UNSCOP found two totally different welcome from Jewish and Arab population. While the Jewish Agency cooperated with UNSCOP, instead, The Arab Higher Committee charged them with being pro-Zionist, believing that the deal had already been made, and decided to boycott it. It was announced a one-day general strike by the Arabs to protest UNSCOP arrival, and Arab opposition were threatened with death if they spoke to them. When visiting Jewish areas, committee members were warmly welcomed with flowers and cheering crowds, and in Tel Aviv was declared public holiday. The streets were decorated with flags and posters, and crowds surrounded the delegates during their tour of the city. By contrast, committee members were ignored and faced hostility in Arab areas. UNSCOP officials met clandestinely with commanders of the Irgun, the right-wing Zionist guerrilla group, and also with members of the High Command of the Haganah, the main Jewish paramilitary organization of the time. Furthermore, during the hearings, Haganah's intelligence branch, Shai, placed microphones in UNSCOP officials' hotel and conference rooms. They tapped all phone conversation, and the cleaning staff was replaced with female Shai agents, who reported back each day on its activities. This did not go unnoticed. A member of the Swedish delegation complained that the cleaning staff of the building was too pretty and educated. They are the eyes and ears of the Zionist leaders, who come to hearings with replies prepared in advance. A leak of information from some members of the UN Committee to the Jewish Agency was also suspected. After 3 months of hearings and general survey, the final report recommended that the Palestine be partitioned into Arab and Jewish state, which should retain an economic union. Jerusalem under international regime. After the report, it proceeded to vote, and the passage of the resolution required a 2/3 majority, not counting abstaining and absent members. On 26 November, the United Nations consisted of 57 member states. The location was the UN General Assembly at Flushing Meadow in New York. So the Zionists easily organized crowds of local supporters to demonstrate outside the building. But the Zionist delegation already didn't have the majority to pass the resolution. So, by filibustering, they managed to delay the vote 3 days until 29th of November. But there was still an undecided country: France. According to multiple sources, had the vote been held on the original set date, it would have received a majority, but less than the required 2/3. The delay was used by supporters of Zionism in New York to put extra pressure on states not supporting the resolution. The Democratic Party, whose large part of the contributions came from Jews, informed Truman that a failure in supporting the Jews on Palestine could be dangerous to the party. According to Roger Cohen, President Truman felt of being a hostage to the lobby, who blamed for the contemporary impasse. Furthermore, Truman noted that the facts were that not only were there pressure movements around the United Nations, unlike anything that had been seen there before, but that the White House, too, was subjected to a constant barrage. I do not think I ever had as much pressure and propaganda aimed at the White House as I had in this instance. The persistence of a few of the extreme Zionist leaders, actuated by political motives and engaging in political threats, disturbed and annoyed me. Even so, other states had complained some pressure from the Zionist, or in some case warnings and threats. India Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru said the Zionists had tried to bribe India with millions, and that the Indian ambassador to the UN had received daily warnings on her life. After a call from Washington, the Philippines' vote changed. Haiti was promised a loan of $5 million, and Libera was threatened aid cuts. It could be affect the decisions. According to Wikipedia, the credentials of the Siamese delegations were cancelled after Siam voted against partition in committee on 25 November. There is also some evidence the Sam Zemurray, aka Sam the Banana Man, an American and Jewish businessman focused on banana trade, used his influence to put pressure on several Central and South America states like Mexico, Colombia, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Guatemala, Ecuador, Panama. The same scenario involved Bernard Baruch, an American Jewish financier and supporter of the Democratic Party, and former economic advisor to President Roosevelt. Baruch, who was also a private supporter of the Irgun, implied a block on planned American aid to France, which had in desperate need of reconstruction after World War II, followed by Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. Everyone voted in favor of Resolution 181. On 29 November 1947, the United Nations General Assembly voted in favor of the modified partition plan, which will henceforth be called Resolution 181. 33 voted for, 13 voted against, 10 states abstained, and 1 was absent, the former Siam, Thailand. Under the 1947 UN partition plan, the 55% of the land were allocated to the Jewish, and just the 42% to the Arab state. Jerusalem was to be placed under international administration. The Jews made up the 30% of the population and owned 6% of the land, and the votation allocated to the 56% of the country, including many of the main cities with Palestinian Arab majorities and the important coastline from Haifa to Jaffa. Instead, the Arab state, with twice the population, more or less 70%, was allotted just 44% of the land. The Arab state was deprived of the most important agricultural lands and seaports. Complicating matters further, roughly half of the population of the proposed Jewish state would be Arab. UNSCOP had intended that Britain should supervise the implementation of partition, but Britain refused. Shortly after the UN Resolution 181, war broke out between Palestinian Arabs and Zionist armed groups. Arab protests soon developed into communal fighting, and armed volunteers arrived from Syria. But nevertheless, they were no match for the Jewish, who had gained extensive training in arms from fighting alongside Britain in World War II. The Arabs who lived in the Zionist territory, terrified by the events such as the massacre of the village Deir Yassin by Irgun, Lehi, and Haganah, left their home en masse. Haifa fell to the Zionists on 22nd of April and Jaffa on 13th of May. These events happened before the British Mandate officially ended. On 14th of May 1948, the last British troops left with the High Commissioner, and on the same day, the Zionists proclaimed the State of Israel, which was promptly recognized by the United States, in accordance with a prior undertaking with President Truman and by the Soviet Union. As a result of the withdrawal of British forces and the declaration of the State of Israel in May 1948, the immigration restrictions to the country were removed, making it possible to implement the policy changes relating to large-scale Aliyah focused on Jews from Arab and Muslim countries, the 1 Million Plan. We came to this country, which was already populated by Arabs, and we are establishing a Hebrew, that is a Jewish, state here. Jewish villages were built in the place of Arab villages. You do not even know the names of the Arab villages, and I do not blame you, because these geography books no longer exists. Not only do the books not exist, but the Arab villages are not there either. Nahalal arose in the place of Mahalul, Gvat in the place of Chibta, Sarid in the place of Hanefs, and Kafar Yehoshua in the place of Tel Shaman. There is not one place built in this country that did not have a former Arab population.